Imagine a city where the air hums with the scent of incense and ambition, where marble gleams under the Mediterranean sun, and where whispers of power echo through every street and alley. This is Rome, the year 64 CE, a place where gods and mortals collide, where one man's desires could reshape lives as easily as a sculptor molds clay. At the heart of this world stands Nero, an emperor whose name would become synonymous with excess, cruelty, and a hunger for control that knew no bounds. But today, we're not here to recount the familiar tales of Nero's reign, the burning of Rome, the persecution of Christians, or the lavish spectacles of his court. No, we're here to uncover a story far more intimate, far more harrowing, a story that reveals the depths of human degradation when absolute power meets unchecked desire. This is the story of Sporus, a boy whose life was shattered to fulfill an emperor's twisted dream of reclaiming a lost love. Let's step back into the world of Nero's Rome, a city pulsing with life yet shadowed by fear. Nero, at 27 years old, is no longer the boy emperor guided by his mother, Agrippina, or his tutor, Seneca. He has tasted power, and it has consumed him. According to the historian Suetonius, writing in his Lives of the Caesars around 121 CE, reign was marked by a theatrical obsession with beauty, art, and his own divine image. He saw himself as Apollo incarnate, a god among men, crafting a world where his whims became reality. But beneath the golden facade of his palace, there was a void, a wound that no amount of wealth or adulation could heal. That wound had a name, Poppaea. Sabina Poppaea, Nero's second wife, was a woman whose beauty and cunning captivated the emperor. Tacitus, in his Annals, written around 116 CE, describes her as a woman of elegance and wit, whose ambition matched Nero's own. She was not merely a consort, she was his obsession, his muse, a symbol of the perfection he craved. Their marriage in 62 CE was a spectacle of opulence, but it was also a union steeped in blood. To marry Poppaea, Nero had divorced and later ordered the execution of his first wife, Octavia, a move that shocked even Rome's jaded elite. Poppaea, pregnant with Nero's child, seemed to secure her place as the empress who would shape his legacy. But fate, or perhaps Nero's own volatility, had other plans. In 65 CE, tragedy struck. Poppaea, pregnant with their second child, died. Under circumstances that remain chillingly ambiguous, Suetonius claims Nero, in a fit of rage, kicked Poppaea in the stomach, causing her death. Tacitus, more cautious, suggests it may have been an accident or even a natural miscarriage, but he doesn't shy away from noting Nero's violent temper. Modern historians like Anthony Barrett, in his 1996 biography Agrippina, lean toward the likelihood of foul play, given Nero's history of impulsive cruelty. Whatever the truth, Poppaea's death left Nero unmoored. Suetonius writes that he wept uncontrollably, refusing to let her body be cremated immediately, instead preserving it with spices and displaying it like a divine relic. He ordered a state funeral, an honor reserved for emperors, and delivered a eulogy praising her beauty as if she were a goddess. But Nero's grief was not just personal, it was performative. A spectacle for a man who lived for the stage. This is where our story takes a darker turn, where the emperor's sorrow twisted into something far more sinister. Nero could not let Poppaea go. He could not accept that death had stolen the one person who, in his mind, completed his divine narrative. According to Cassius Dio, writing in his Roman history around 230 CE, Nero's obsession with Poppaea's memory drove him to desperate measures. He sought to recreate her, to defy the gods themselves by bringing her back in form, if not in spirit. Enter Sporus, a young boy whose life would become a tragic footnote in the annals of Rome's excesses, who was. The ancient sources are frustratingly sparse, but what we do know paints a picture of a vulnerable figure caught in the emperor's gaze. Suetonius describes him as a youth of remarkable beauty, likely a freedman or a slave, possibly of Greek or Eastern origin, given the cultural associations with such beauty in Roman society. His name, Sporus, meaning seed or sowing in Latin, may have been a nickname given by Nero, a cruel irony considering what was to come. Cassius Dio adds that Sporus bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea, a detail that sealed his fate. In Nero's eyes, this boy was not a person, but a canvas, a vessel to resurrect his lost love. What followed was an act so brutal, so dehumanizing, that it challenges our understanding of power and its capacity to corrupt. Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated. Let that sink in for a moment. This was not a medical procedure performed with care or consent. It was a deliberate act of mutilation, designed to erase Sporus's identity as a male and mold him into a facsimile of Poppaea. Castration in the ancient world was not uncommon. Eunuchs served in palaces and temples across the Mediterranean, but it was almost always a punishment or a means of control, rarely a choice. The Roman physician Galen, writing a century later, describes the procedure as excruciating, often performed without anesthesia, with a high risk of infection or death. For Sporus, likely no older than 15, the physical pain was only the beginning. The psychological toll, the loss of bodily autonomy, the stripping away of his identity would have been unimaginable. Why castration? To Nero, it was a means to an end. In Roman society, gender was performative, tied to roles and appearances. By removing Sporus's masculinity, Nero could dress him in women's clothing, style his hair like Poppaea, and present him as a living replica of his dead wife. Suetonius recounts that Nero called Sporus Poppaea and treated him as his Empress, parading him through Rome in a litter, kissing him publicly, and even staging a mock wedding. Cassius Dio goes further, describing the ceremony as a grotesque spectacle, with Sporus veiled as a bride and Nero playing the groom, surrounded by courtiers forced to play along. The court, ever fearful of Nero's wrath, complied. But the whispers of disgust must have been deafening. Let's pause here not to break the story, but to reflect on what this meant for Sporus. Imagine being a boy, already powerless in a world ruled by wealth and status, suddenly thrust into the emperor's orbit. You're not a citizen with rights. You're property, a commodity. Your body is no longer your own. Your name is replaced, your identity erased, all to serve a man who sees you as nothing more than a prop in his personal drama. Modern psychological studies, like those by Judith Herman in her 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, describe the effects of such dehumanization, dissociation, shame, and a profound sense of helplessness. Sporus, trapped in Nero's golden cage, had no escape. Every glance in a polished bronze mirror would have reminded him of what he'd lost, of the role he was forced to play. But Nero's obsession with Sporus wasn't just about grief. It was about power, absolute power. As the historian, Lord Acton, famously wrote, corrupts absolutely. Nero's ability to reshape another human being physically, socially, even emotionally demonstrated his dominion over life itself. Tacitus, though he doesn't mention Sporus directly, describes Nero's reign as one where no one was safe from his caprices. The emperor's court was a theater of fear, where senators, freedmen, and slaves alike lived under the shadow of his whim. Sporus was not an anomaly. He was a symptom of a system where one man's desires outweighed the humanity of those around him. What did Rome think of this? The sources suggest a mix of horror and resignation. Suetonius, writing decades later, frames the story as evidence of Nero's depravity, a tale to shock his readers. Cassius Dio, more sensational, emphasizes the public's discomfort, noting that even Nero's most loyal sycophants found the charade unsettling, yet no one dared intervene. To challenge Nero was to court death, as countless others, senators, generals, even his own mother had learned. Archaeological evidence, like the graffiti found in Pompeii, reveals a public that mocked Nero's excesses behind his back, but in his presence, silence was survival. For Sporus, survival meant enduring a life of performance. Dressed in silks, adorned with jewels, he was displayed at banquets, forced to smile and play the part of Poppaea. Nero's affection, if it can be called that, was suffocating. Suetonius writes that the emperor would embrace Sporus in public, a gesture that, in context, feels less like love and more like possession. The boy's beauty, once his curse, became his prison. And yet, in the cracks of this nightmare, we must wonder, did Sporus find ways to cope? Did he cling to fragments of his former self, or did he lose himself entirely in the role Nero imposed? The sources don't tell us, and perhaps that silence is the greatest tragedy of all. As Nero's reign spiraled into chaos, Sporus remained a constant in his orbit. The year 66 CE saw Nero embark on a grand tour of Greece, where he competed in chariot races and musical contests, basking in orchestrated adulation. Sporus accompanied him, still playing the role of Empress. Cassius Dio notes that Nero's behavior grew increasingly erratic, alienating even his allies. The empire was fraying, rebellions brewed in the provinces, the treasury dwindled, and the Senate grew restless. Yet Nero seemed oblivious, lost in his fantasy of divine artistry, with Sporus as his unwilling muse. The Mediterranean sun beat down on Greece, where Nero's entourage moved like a traveling circus, a spectacle of excess, trailing the emperor's every step. It was 66 CE, and Nero, now 29, was at the height of his self-styled apotheosis, casting himself as a god artist, a living Apollo. The Greek cities, eager to curry favor, showered him with victories in their games, chariot races, poetry contests, even musical performances where his mediocre lyre-playing drew rapturous applause. Yet amid the gilded pageantry, one figure stood out, not for power or ambition, but for the quiet tragedy he embodied. Sporus, the boy remade as Poppaea, ever present at Nero's side. Dressed in flowing gowns, his hair styled in the intricate curls of a Roman matron, he was a living ghost, a reminder of the emperor's refusal to let go of his lost wife. But as Nero's world began to crumble, Sporus's story would take turns that reveal not just the cruelty of one man, but the fragility of an empire built on fear. Cassius Dio, in his Roman history, paints a vivid picture of Nero's Greek tour, describing how the emperor demanded constant adoration, forcing cities to erect statues in his honor and rewrite their histories to glorify him. Sporus, as the Empress, was part of this theater. At banquets in Athens or Corinth, he sat beside Nero, his delicate features illuminated by lamplight, his silence a stark contrast to the raucous laughter of the court. Suetonius tells us that Nero treated Sporus with a possessive affection, showering him with gifts, jewels, silks, even estates, yet these were not gestures of love, but chains, binding Sporus to his role. The boy's castration, performed perhaps 2 years earlier, had already stripped him of his physical identity. Now Nero's relentless attention sought to erase his soul. What must it have been like for Sporus in those moments? Modern psychological research, like Bessel van der Kolk's work in The Body Keeps the Score, 2014, suggests that prolonged trauma reshapes the mind, forcing victims to compartmentalize their pain to survive. Sporus, surrounded by sycophants and spies, had no allies, every word, every gesture was scrutinized. For Nero's court was a place where loyalty was fleeting and betrayal deadly. Did he learn to mimic Poppaea's mannerisms perfectly, to avoid the emperor's wrath? Did he find solace in the routine of his role, or did each day deepen his despair? The ancient sources are silent on his inner life, but their silence speaks volumes. Sporus was not a senator or a general whose deeds might be recorded. He was a pawn, his humanity irrelevant to the historians of the time. Yet Sporus's presence was more than a personal tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting Nero's unraveling psyche. According to Tacitus, Nero's obsession with theatricality had always bordered on madness, but by 66 CE, it was spiraling into delusion. He believed he could bend reality itself, not just through art but through sheer will. Sporus was the ultimate proof of this power, a boy transformed into a woman, a living monument to Nero's ability to defy nature and death. But this act of creation came at a cost. Cassius Dio notes that even Nero's inner circle, men hardened by years of flattery and violence, found the charade unsettling. The mock wedding, the public displays of affection, the insistence on calling Sporus Poppaea, these were not just eccentricities but affronts to Roman sensibilities, where gender roles and social order were sacrosanct. In Greece, Nero's excesses reached new heights. He declared the Isthmus of Corinth would be cut to create a canal, a project so ambitious it would not be realized for centuries. He performed in theaters, demanding ovations that lasted hours. Sporus, ever the silent companion, was there, a prop in Nero's grand narrative, but beneath the surface, the empire was fraying. Back in Rome, the Senate whispered of rebellion. The provinces, bled dry by taxes to fund Nero's spectacles, simmered with discontent. Archaeological evidence, such as inscriptions from Gaul and Judea, shows growing unrest, with local elites chafing under Rome's yoke. Nero, lost in his Greek fantasy, seemed oblivious, but Sporus, trapped at his side, could not have missed the tension in the air. By 67 CE, Nero's tour ended, and he returned to Rome, triumphant in his own mind, but dangerously out of touch. Suetonius describes his homecoming as a parody of a military triumph, with Nero riding in a chariot wearing a purple robe and clutching a lyre instead of a scepter. Sporus, still playing Poppaea, was at his side, a living symbol of the emperor's detachment from reality. The people of Rome, once charmed by Nero's charisma, now mocked him in private. Graffiti uncovered in Pompeii, preserved by Vesuvius's ash, includes jibes at Nero's womanly behavior, perhaps a veiled reference to his treatment of Sporus. Yet in public, the crowds cheered, for to do otherwise was to risk the Praetorian Guard's wrath. The year 68 CE marked the beginning of the end. Rebellions erupted across the empire. In Gaul, the governor Vindex rallied troops against Nero, declaring him a tyrant. In Spain, Galba, an aging senator, joined the revolt, backed by the legions. Tacitus writes that Nero, initially dismissive, grew increasingly erratic as the news worsened. He alternated between grandiose plans to crush the rebels and bouts of despair, weeping for his lost glory. Sporus remained a constant, a source of comfort in Nero's unraveling world. But what did this mean for the boy himself? Was he a passive victim, or did he, in some small way, manipulate his role to survive? The sources offer no answers, but human nature suggests resilience, even in the darkest circumstances. Sporus, after years in Nero's orbit, may have learned to navigate the emperor's moods, to play the part with just enough conviction to avoid punishment. As the empire turned against him, Nero's paranoia deepened. He ordered executions of suspected traitors, including senators and even loyalists who faltered in their flattery. Suetonius recounts how Nero, fearing betrayal, surrounded himself with a shrinking circle of devotees, among them Sporus. In a chilling detail, Cassius Dio writes that Nero planned to flee to Egypt, taking Sporus with him, to live as a private citizen and perform as a musician. The plan was delusional, a fantasy of a man who could no longer distinguish his stage from reality. But before it could materialize, the end came swiftly. In June 68 CE, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy, stripping him of his title. Abandoned by the Praetorians, Nero fled Rome with a handful of followers, including Sporus. Suetonius describes the final hours with grim detail. Nero, hiding in a villa outside the city, paced in panic, clutching a dagger and weeping. Was there, silent, perhaps numb to the chaos? Did he feel a flicker of hope, knowing Nero's fall might free him? Or was he too broken to imagine a life beyond his role? As Nero prepared to take his own life, he hesitated, famously crying, "What an artist dies in me." With the help of a freedman, he drove a blade into his throat, ending his reign at 30. Sporus, the boy who had been Poppaea, was left in the wreckage, but Sporus's story does not end with Nero's death. In the chaotic year of the 4 emperors that followed, he became a pawn once more. Cassius Dio tells us that Sporus was taken into the household of Nymphidius Sabinus, a Praetorian prefect who briefly schemed to seize power. When Nymphidius was killed, Sporus passed to Otho, one of Nero's successors. Otho, who had once been Poppaea's husband before Nero stole her, treated Sporus with a strange mix of pity and possession, perhaps seeing in him a twisted echo of his own lost love. But Otho's reign lasted mere months, ending in 69 CE, with his suicide after defeat by It was under Vitellius, the 3rd emperor of that bloody year, that Sporus met his final, horrific fate. Cassius Dio recounts that Vitellius, seeking to humiliate Nero's memory, planned to stage a public spectacle where Sporus would be raped, before a crowd, cast as a mythological figure in a grotesque reenactment. The details are sparse, but the intent was clear: to degrade Sporus further, to reduce him to a symbol of Nero's shame. Faced with this unbearable violation, Sporus took his own life. Suetonius, in a rare moment of restraint, simply notes that Sporus died by his own hand in 69 CE, likely no older than 20. The boy who had been reshaped, renamed, and paraded as Poppaea was gone, his death barely a footnote in Rome's turbulent history. What do we make of Sporus's story? It is tempting to see him as a victim, and he was brutally, undeniably so. Nero's power, unchecked by law or morality, stripped him of his body, his identity, his future. Yet Sporus's endurance, his survival through years of trauma, speaks to a quiet strength, even if the sources do not celebrate it. His final act, choosing death over further degradation, was a reclaiming of agency, however tragic. Modern historians like Edward Champlin, in his 2003 book, Nero, argue that Sporus's story reveals the limits of imperial power. Nero could reshape a boy's body, but he could not control the human spirit's capacity to resist, even in silence. For us, Sporus's fate is a window into the darker facets of Rome, a reminder of what happens when power becomes a god unto itself. The archaeological record coins bearing Nero's face, statues of his divine poses, shows a man obsessed with his own myth, but Sporus, unnamed in those inscriptions, was the cost of that myth. His story challenges us to look beyond the grandeur of empires, to see the lives crushed beneath their weight. As we walk away from this tale, let's carry with us not just horror, but empathy for Sporus, for the countless others whose names history forgot, and for the fragility of humanity in the shadow of absolute power.